Hello and welcome to Golden Geography. Today we're going to be looking at exploring oceans and particularly the use of biological resources from within the oceans. And we're going to be focusing on whaling. So a little bit of warning, there are some slightly unpleasant images in this video. So a little history about whaling. There is evidence of whaling for food, for resources going back to 3,000 years BCE, before Common Era. So when we're looking at particularly the Inuit populations of parts of the Northern Atlantic or North Pacific, there is a history, a culture of this, and it was their main source of food. We find that that has continued into the 17th century, where again there's a history of this. We have stories about Moby Dick and other such kind of legendary activity tied into whaling and the history around whaling. If we look to modern days, then actually from the 1950s to the 1980s there was commercial whaling, and that's when actually whaling started to become a problem, because the numbers of whales being hunted was more than sustainable levels would allow. And then we have present day activities where there are a few countries that do steal whale, but most do not. So if we look at those countries that do steal whale, there are not that many globally. Japan is the number one, and if we were looking in 2017, their numbers were at 596 whales. Other countries such as Norway and Greenland do whale steal, but they tend to have slightly less numbers, slightly less of research focus. In Norway, they're looking more at commercial whaling for products, for food, for the meat, for the blubber. Indigenous whaling takes place in Greenland and Russia and parts of Alaska as well. So there are some reasons why some areas do still have whaling that are to do with history and culture, as well as those which are much more commercial today. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at whales as a renewable biological resource, because they are a biological resource. They have a reproductive cycle, which means actually they can be a renewable source. We're going to think a little bit about the use and the management of that resource. We're going to think about how the values and attitudes, the socioeconomic status and political context of different stakeholders influence their views and their management of that resource, and also what the resilience levels are of that resource and what that means in terms of key thresholds and how to manage biological resources. So we're going to focus on whaling in Iceland. When we're looking at Iceland, we are thinking predominantly about whaling around the western coastline, around the capital of Reykjavik, and we've got the Reykjavik Peninsula here, and more importantly the Faxaflói Bay, which is where whaling occurs. The irony being, this is also one of the most populated parts of Iceland and the area which receives most tourism. So Faxaflói Bay is an area which experiences both whale watching and whale hunting. If we think a little bit about whaling, it has many resources. Most people would associate it with food, so meat production, or the use of blubber in oils, as you can see in the image here. But actually the bones, the skin, every single part of the whale within traditional cultures would be used. Today, in a more commercial sense, we are still focusing on the meat and the oil production, but it is a resource, and if you are thinking about this in a commercial scale, it is a good viable economic activity. Whales are big, you get a lot of resource for your efforts. If you're thinking about it from a cultural or historical perspective, it was something that was needed for your community to survive. One whale could make the big difference. It could be a food source for several weeks, even months or more. If we think about how to manage this resource, this important resource, well, historically, for many thousands of years, that would have been done by communities knowing about whales and which whales to hunt, making sure that they didn't take younger whales, they would be looking for older members of the community. Today, however, that management is done internationally through countries' agreement and through the work of the IWC, or the International Whaling Community. The International Whaling Community has, as you can see on the map, a significant number of members. There are countries, particularly within Central Africa and parts of Central Asia, that have never been a member, but when you think about the routes on which whales migrate from parts of the Southern Ocean through the Atlantic, actually some of those key countries that have that coastline are members, and that is important. The IWC has been involved in managing and monitoring this resource for a long time. Okay, so what about different stakeholders? Stakeholders are groups of people or organisations that have a vested interest in that resource and what happens. And those stakeholders will have very specific values and attitudes. So if we're thinking about values, those people or organisations will have values about things that they believe are important. So they will value whales. They will think whales are an important key species, and therefore their attitude towards them is influenced by their values. Now, that may change based on their socioeconomic status or the political context in which it's found. So if you are thinking a little bit about indigenous communities, the political context there is very much more relaxed, and hunting is part of their history and culture, so it is less seen as controversial. Whereas if you're thinking places like Japan and Iceland, which are socioeconomically developed, have other sources of food, there the political context and the political pressure from other countries is much greater. So we're going to look at a range. We're going to look at 4 different groups of people within the context of our Iceland case study, and think a little bit about their values and attitudes towards whaling and how that might reflect their socioeconomic status or the political context. So we're going to start with Christian Jossen. He is the owner of the one and only company that does do whaling within Iceland. So he values whales as a source of food, as an economic activity. It's his business. So he has a very positive attitude towards whaling. It's something that he actively takes part in and promotes as part of their culture, as well as their economic activity. He is supported politically because he is given permission to whale within Faxafloy Bay, and that is regularly reviewed and reissued, but to date he still has that ability. There was a bit of a pause during COVID because of challenges associated with COVID, but he has restarted his hunting ships, and you can see them in the image there. So for him, it's an important resource. He values it. It's his business. It's his socio-economic activity, and he has political support for that. We also have here the Icelandic government, and that is reflected by Minister Gunnarsdóttir, and she has to balance both the cultural and historic demands and the economic demands of those in favour of whaling, along with those, particularly from the tourist industry, that are very anti-whaling. So she has a difficult choice. She's got to balance those viewpoints. So her values and attitudes towards whaling is very much a case of, well, what can we use it for? How does it benefit our country? Does it have more of a benefit in terms of hunting or more of a benefit for tourism? So she's got to consider both of those. You could argue that she sits on the fence, but she has issued whaling permits recently. She's kind of reissued those. We also have here some of the local community. There was a recent survey conducted of which 51% of Icelanders said, actually, no, we don't want hunting. It's not something we want to happen. And that has been supported internationally by those who are pro-green activities, so in support of challenging climate change and addressing climate issues. but also those who just are not keen on it in terms of the tourism element. It kind of undermines whale watching and the environmental element of tourism to Iceland. And then the tourist industry itself, they, as I just said, support the locals in not really wanting whaling. It is a key industry, it's a growing industry, it's a really important industry to Iceland actually, and it's an important economic activity for people to do. And you can see here that there are boats that take people out to see the whales, and it is a driver of that economic activity that is more sustainable, because here you are just watching the whales, you're not removing them from the ocean. So there are some really positive views of tourism, and from that perspective, that value of the whale as a living organism means that they are very anti-whaling. However, ironically, there are some tourists who go whale watching and then go to have lunch and eat whales. So not every tourist agrees. Well, whatever viewpoint you're coming from, however you are looking at it, you need to think of it as a resource. And we've already mentioned that it's a biological resource and it has a reproductive cycle. Because it's such a large animal, it has a long reproductive cycle, which means if you take an animal out of the population, it will have a bigger impact. One animal will have a bigger impact on the population size because of that long reproductive cycle. So if there's any event that happens, it could be to do with climate change, changing oceanic waters, it could be an oil spill, it could be disease. But if there's any event that happens that causes the population to bottleneck, that means decrease rapidly in number, then actually it may not have the ability to recover. So if your event is hunting, and you hunt the number of individuals to a very small number, you reduce their genetic diversity. So even if the numbers increase, which is what you can see on the image at the bottom on the right, even if the numbers increase, they may not have the genetic diversity to recover. You might have a very limited genetic diversity after your event, which means those species are much more at risk. Hopefully they will recover, but you might find because of that lack of genetic diversity, you face extinction events. Well, the IWC in 1982 realised that globally hunting of whales was too much of a challenge, and that the population of different types of whale species were not really being used sustainably. So they put in place something called a moratorium, which is basically a ban, and most countries agreed to it, with the exceptions of countries like Iceland and Japan. And as a result, there has been an increase in the number of individuals. But it needs time. Just because there are more individuals does not mean there is more genetic diversity. There needs time for genetic mutations to take place and that genetic diversity to re-establish itself. So in terms of resilience, historically biologists would look at individuals in a species and say, look, you need a X number, 50 or 500 individuals to maintain genetic diversity. That is difficult when you're looking at different types of species, so there's been a little bit of a movement away from X number of individuals is needed. Rather, they look at populations now and say, well, how viable are they? If there are 50 individuals within this whale community, is that viable? Or does it need 5,000? And that's what's being done to look at the resilience of whaling, to look at it and go, okay, how many are there globally? How many are there within the Atlantic? How many could be taken out, hunted, and that resource still be sustainable or still be resilient? And those numbers are quite low when it comes to whales because they're so big. 1 or 2 individuals does make a significant difference. So the resilience of whales is quite low, and that's the challenge with whaling. It's very easy to go beyond that threshold. So therefore the management, particularly by the IWC, is really important. The IWC, that moratorium, was really important in enabling whale stocks to slowly recover. But the IWC is not a policing organisation. It has no way to enforce the moratorium, which is why countries can just leave it and do whatever they want. So it's great countries are willing to sign up and to support the IWC in managing whaling, but it is difficult to maintain that and to enforce those rules that they've established. Okay, time for a quick quiz. Pause the video and answer the questions. Here we go, here are your answers. And here we have a couple of essays that you could answer using whaling as part of or the whole for the answer. So have a little look, see how you could answer these questions using this case study. Thanks for listening.